Giant sets are the real-world equivalent of the hyperbolic time chamber from the anime series Dragon Ball Z. This is a fictional time and space dimension where fighters could get a whole year worth of training in just one day. And even though the magnitude of such training volume advantage is not comparable to the real world, obviously, the underlying principle still applies. Giant sets are a great vehicle to get more work done within the same time you would spend in the gym. But before I go in depth on this accumulation method, I would like to clarify what a giant set is not. A giant set is not a random succession of general movements that are meant to keep you engaged for an X amount of time in a circuit style. That's GPP, General Physical Preparedness. This type of training definitely has merit for general fitness, cardiovascular endurance, stamina, metabolic conditioning, etc., etc. But it's not very effective for muscle growth unless you're an absolute beginner, of course. If getting jacked and looking like you lift is your long-term goal, then hypertrophy training principles must be upheld when we program giant sets. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you some general guidelines as to how to apply giant sets into your training. Please bear in mind that these are all experience-based, meaning that I came up with these after a few years of training, trial and error, trying things out, putting exercises together, and seeing what worked and what didn't. This video is a nice baseline compilation of principles that you can adhere to if you're starting to think about implementing giant sets into your training. Multi-joint barbell movements that engage large chunks of muscle mass are inherently not the best candidates for giant sets because the tension is dispersed across a very sizable area, especially if the lower body is engaged in any capacity. You would want to focus all the stress onto a rather smaller part of your body, one exercise at a time, because it will be then the sum of all of the movements within the giant set that will eventually result in a much larger section of your body being challenged at a muscular level. Thus, exercises that lend themselves to laser-focused concentration work are very much preferred. However, like everything in life, you can always accommodate some exceptions here and there. Me personally, I think that bodyweight movements like inverted rows and push-ups could work very well within a giant set. Or you can even go as far as to say that a posterior chain exercise like an RDL with a barbell could be a good fit for a giant set, provided that you employ this movement as the opener exercise and then it is followed by smaller isolation lifts that work the opposite side of the body. Dumbbell flies for the chest, skull crushers for the triceps, and side delt raises for the medial deltoid come to mind. When it comes to giant sets, the how takes precedence over the what. If you only care about completing as many reps as you can by all means necessary, you'll find yourself resorting to momentum, excessive body language, shortening the range of motion, and all sorts of mechanical compensations. A little bit of body English here and there towards the end of a set could be helpful at times, but you should approach giant sets with the goal of performing as many high-quality reps as you can. Standard execution, controlled negative, explosive concentric, and the maximum productive range of motion for your own body structure. 0 reps in reserve should be the bare minimum work required, especially when you work with guided machines or cables. Failure should be the default outcome most times, and sometimes exercises would even allow you to go beyond failure through partial repetitions. The fact that you're going to be working mostly with isolation lifts means that giant sets are a perfect environment for you to push yourself to muscular exhaustion at every single opportunity. The fatigue cost is quite small and easy to recover from during the workout for as long as you are not completely out of shape and you have a decent work capacity, which you should have developed throughout the entire beginner phase as you're building a base of muscle and strength. When doing giant sets, you should be working with rather high rep ranges, given that the majority of lifts in a giant set are going to be isolation movements. For those type of exercises, it makes more sense to use a more moderate intensity range. There is very little hypertrophic benefit in performing triples for calf raises or sets of 5 for lateral delt raises. As a general rule of thumb, the less the muscle targeted in a lift, the higher the repetitions you should be working with. 8 to 15 is only a decent ballpark I'm giving you because I think that is going to work in most cases, but please feel free to adjust the numbers based on your experience, okay? At the end of the day, you need to figure out what works best for you. When it comes to exercise selection with a hypertrophy bias, you would want to pick movements that have an eccentric phase. Therefore, pulling off the floor lifts or Olympic lifts like the snatch and clean and jerk and variations thereof are no good to include in giant sets. At this point, I'd like to remind you that I've already created a whole series showcasing 8 different examples of these giant sets for hypertrophy. You can check out this series if you want to take a look into each one of them separately to learn what is actually happening from a muscle anatomy standpoint. But today you're already seeing some of these giant sets on the screen as I'm sharing these general guidelines with all of you. Giant sets are one of those resistance training tools that requires an above average technique, I would say. If your execution is already sloppy in any of the exercises outside a giant set, what do you think is going to happen when you have to perform these in an environment where you're physically fatigued 3 to 4 minutes deep into the set? You can't afford to exhibit poor and inconsistent technique during giant sets. If you're not confident about it, please stay away from them. Go back to the base building phase where you learn and practice each of the movements separately. For this reason alone, noobs shouldn't be attempting to do giant sets in most cases. They might be able to do a watered down, fluff and pump, going through the motion type of junk volume and call it a giant set, but those are neither effective or what I'd recommend to gain muscle. And this is somehow connected to what I just mentioned. Giant sets are not meant to be used to build a strength and muscle base. That's what the old school big 8 to 10 classic movements are for when you're a complete beginner, and a more minimally training approach makes more sense. Giant sets tend to favor tiers of exercises below the basic compound barbell movements that everyone should attempt to master at the start. Depending on your individual goals and preferences, these tiers could complement or even replace one of the classic top movements in the future. You'll see that giant sets are the perfect testing ground for you to experiment with implements outside the standard barbell. This is a great time for specialty bars, dumbbells, cables, and guided machines to shine in their own right. The most beneficial characteristic of a giant set is the ability to accumulate training volume in a short time window. It is only at the last stages of a beginner phase that most people will start benefiting from doing 3+ exercises back to back. If your goals are biased towards building a great physique, giant sets made up mainly of isolation lifts towards the last third of your session could help you get a higher hypertrophic response now that you get to overload smaller muscles outside the staple compounds. The only requirement for you to get the most out of giant sets is to avoid muscle overlapping in your exercise selection. You're seeing on the screen 2 examples of giant sets. One is an abomination, the other is a perfectly valid way to finish off your training. Both examples are done towards the end of a workout, and both are made up of isolation lifts only. However, the example on the left won't allow you to perform at your best in each of the movements because of the overemphasis on the biceps, not to mention the fact that the soreness that you might get could be extremely acute and last for a couple of days. This is no bueno because you're essentially exceeding your recovery capacities to be ready for the next workout. The better approach to complete a giant set without sacrificing load and incur such an excessive level of local fatigue and DOMs would be to ensure that the primary muscle movers in each movement are all different. All this means is that there is a need for a bare minimum knowledge of muscle anatomy when you program giant sets. As I mentioned before, giant sets are better suited for those of you pursuing aesthetic goals primarily. This would be something like working towards a bigger chest instead of trying to get a bigger bench press. The first approach would focus on exhausting a specific muscle to cause growth through a variety of lifts. The second approach, however, would try to maximize force production in one single lift. Each of those goals would require different strategies, although some of the tools employed are going to be quite similar. Size and strength are highly correlated, and thus it is common practice in the lifting world to borrow principles from each camp. All in all, giant sets are the kind of tool that would be most commonly employed by bodybuilders and hypertrophy enthusiasts. For me personally, the thing I like the most about giant sets is the multi-dimensional gains you get from them. From a physique perspective, giant sets are great to promote muscular development, as we've previously discussed. From a performance perspective, giant sets are also great to improve your work capacity because you're essentially forcing yourself to complete an ungodly amount of work within a very short period of time. And from a mental standpoint, giant sets are excellent to teach you to reach muscular failure constantly, lift after lift, without taking much of a rest. And that is a skill you really want to first develop and then get much better at if you're planning on adding a significant amount of muscle mass onto your frame. So basically, giant sets teach your body how to redline multiple times in a row and be okay with it. And this is the part where I see most beginners fail. Most noobs exit an exercise because they feel tired, not because they can no longer complete one more repetition of any given exercise. Noobs can't tell the difference between cardiovascular fatigue and muscular fatigue. And that is a problem when it comes to giant sets. They just feel tired overall and give up because of it. So that's why I wouldn't recommend giant sets to beginner lifters without a foundation on both muscle and strength. So now I'm going to do a quick recap with all of you to kind of summarize all the different principles that I've touched upon throughout this video. If you are a complete beginner, giant sets are not for you yet. Focus on building a base of strength, muscle, and work capacity through a small basket of time-tested classic compound lifts. Once you hit your first major plateau after maybe a year or two, then consider the possibility of including giant sets into your training if your goals lean more towards hypertrophy and aesthetics. And the best time to use this tool, giant sets, would be in the second half of your workout after you have completed your heavy-duty work for the day with staple movements for the most part. As for exercise selection, isolation movements are preferred for the most part, although you could accommodate some exceptions like I do. Additionally, high RP levels, that means really high exertion levels, are a must in each of the lifts, especially if we are talking about isolation work using guided machines or cables. Moderate intensity ranges are better suited for giant sets since the amount of muscle mass that is going to be engaged in most of the isolation lift is going to be small, so I offered you the 8 to 15 rep range ballpark, which is a decent one to start with if you don't have any preconceived notion on how to apply giant sets, but I can think of a bunch of different movements where I would feel more comfortable going beyond 15 repetitions. So all I'm trying to say is that feel free to find the repetition scheme you're going to be more comfortable with and then run with it. This point is important. Please be sure to understand which muscle or muscles are engaged in each of the lifts within the giant sets to avoid muscle overlapping. The last thing you like to do is to bury one single muscle group into the ground and leave it for that, meaning that that muscle group is sore for like the next 5 to 6 days and then you can't train it again. There is no real benefit in doing so unless you are a competitive professional bodybuilder at a very advanced level. And lastly, let me remind you that there is nothing inherently magical about giant sets. All we're doing is to remove the rest time in between straight sets. That's it. They're just a tool to get more work done within the same training slots you have in a week. But the clear upside of including giant sets into your training is that in the process you're going to learn to normalize muscular failure and maximum effort multiple times within the confines of a single training session, which is the ultimate reason why so few people actually employ this tool into their training. Giant sets are meant to confront the lifter with extremely high levels of discomfort. I really hope you found a ton of value in today's video. If you did, please check out this other video popping up on the screen right now. I think you're gonna like it. Please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to click on the bell to get notified every time a new video goes live. Stay fit, stay strong, help me raise an army of Super Saiyans all around the world. Peace.